April 9, 1865, the McLean House, Appomattox Court House, Virginia. The sitting room of Wilmer McLean's farmhouse is not large. It is in fact a modest space, a parlor with 2 tables, some chairs, a fireplace, and the ordinary furnishings of a middle-class Virginia home. It does not look like the room where the most consequential surrender in American history is about to take place. Outside, the Army of Northern Virginia, the most formidable fighting force the Confederacy ever fielded. The army that had humiliated the Union for 4 years under the most gifted military commander America ever produced is waiting. Robert E. Lay, in his finest dress uniform, sword gleaming, sits at one of the tables. He is waiting for the Union general who has run him to ground, when Ulysses S. Grant walks through the door. The contrast is almost theatrical in its improbability. Lee is 60 years old and magnificent, over 6 feet tall, silver-haired, erect, dressed as if for a portrait. He looks exactly like what every romantic mythology of the Old South wanted him to be, a nobleman in defeat, surrendering with unassailable dignity. Grant is 42 years old and looks like he has been sleeping in a ditch. He is wearing a private's muddy field blouse with general's shoulder straps awkwardly attached. His boots are spattered with Virginia mud. He has no sword. He had not found the time to send for it. He is 5 feet 8 inches tall, slightly built, with a short brown beard going gray, and the tired eyes of a man who has not properly slept in 11 months. He has ridden 50 miles that morning because his head hurt, and he thought the movement might help. This improbable, mud-spattered, headachy figure is the man who saved the United States of America. The 2 generals sit. They talk briefly of the Mexican War, where they had both served as junior officers 20 years before. Grant writes the surrender terms himself in pencil on a pad he carries in his pocket. The terms are extraordinary in their generosity. Confederate officers keep their sidearms. All men who own horses or mules may keep them to work their farms. No one will be prosecuted for treason. This will have the best possible effect upon the men, Lee says. It will be very gratifying and will do much toward conciliating our people. When the news reaches the Union lines outside, the soldiers begin to fire their artillery in celebration. Grant orders them to stop. The Confederates are our countrymen again, he says. The war is over. Let them go home. 4 years, 2 months, and 27 days after the first shots at Fort Sumter. 620,000 Americans dead. A nation torn in half and put back together, imperfectly, at the price of everything. And the man who did it, the man without whose military genius, without whose iron refusal to accept defeat, without whose absolute determination to fight through every loss until the Union was restored, is standing in a muddy farmhouse in Virginia, ordering his men not to celebrate over the bodies of their defeated countrymen. This is Ulysses S. Grant, not the drunk that his enemies described, not the butcher that the lost cause mythology needed him to be, not the corrupt figurehead that a century of lazy historical writing made him, the man who saved the country. The man who started from nothing, failed at everything, picked himself up every single time, and then, when the country needed him, turned out to be exactly, precisely, irreplaceably the right man. This is his full story. Point Pleasant, Ohio, the boy from the river town, April 27, 1822. Point Pleasant, Clermont County, Ohio. Hiram Ulysses Grant is born in a 2-room tannery cottage on the north bank of the Ohio River, in a town so small that it barely earns the designation of settlement. His father is Jesse Root Grant, a man of fierce opinions, commercial ambition, and an ego large enough to fill any room he entered twice. Jesse Grant is a tanner by trade, a Whig by politics, and an abolitionist by conviction, a man who grew up partially in the household of Owen Brown, father of the future radical abolitionist John Brown, and who absorbed from that environment a bone-deep hostility to human slavery that he maintained throughout his life. Jesse Grant is also, to be direct about it, an extremely difficult person. He is boastful, argumentative, and congenitally unable to resist the opportunity to tell people what they are doing wrong. He has opinions about everything and shares all of them, loudly, with anyone who will listen and most people who would prefer not to. His wife, the boy's mother, is Hannah Simpson Grant, and she is everything her husband is not. She is quiet, reserved, almost unnervingly self-contained. She never boasts, she never brags. When her son becomes the most celebrated military hero in the history of the Republic, she will decline to discuss it. She does not celebrate, she does not express pride in public. She simply continues. The boy inherits almost nothing from his father. He inherits almost everything from his mother. The name is a small comedy of errors. His parents intend to name him Hiram Ulysses Grant, Hiram after his grandfather, Ulysses after the hero of Greek mythology whose name Jesse pulled from a ballot when he couldn't decide. The boy's initials, HUG, were a source of embarrassment that the family was already aware of and would soon arrange to avoid. When his congressman, Thomas Hamer, files the West Point nomination papers years later, he writes down Ulysses S. Grant, giving him his mother's maiden name as a middle initial. There is no S for anything. The S stands for nothing. It is a clerical error that will follow Ulysses Grant for the rest of his life. He does not, for the record, correct it. The family moves to Georgetown, Ohio, in 1823, a slightly larger town where Jesse has established a more successful tannery business. Georgetown is where Grant grows up, a small Ohio River town with a courthouse square, a few hundred residents, the permanent smell of the tannery, and the particular rhythms of small-town Midwestern life in the early 19th century. Grant is a quiet, serious child with two distinguishing characteristics. The first is an absolute, lifelong revulsion at the blood and gore of the tannery, an aversion so complete that he refuses, throughout his life, to eat meat that has any trace of pinkness in it, and turns away from wounds with a squeamishness that his fellow officers will find deeply incongruous in a man who orders men into combat without flinching. The second, and far more significant, is an almost supernatural ability with horses. From the age of 5, young Ulysses Grant can handle horses that no one else can manage. He can break a horse no adult can approach. He can ride animals that throw experienced horsemen. He has an instinctive, wordless communication with horses that the people of Georgetown recognize as something extraordinary, not just talent, but a genuine, unusual gift. His father uses this gift as a form of free labor. The boy hauls logs, operates the farm equipment, runs errands all on horseback. From the time he is small enough that he has to be lifted into the saddle. Grant does not love Georgetown. He does not love the tannery whose smell makes him feel sick. He does not love his father's booming, opinionated presence. He loves his mother's quiet. He loves horses. He loves books when he can get them. He does not know yet what he is for. West Point, The Reluctant Soldier, 1839, West Point, New York. Grant is 17 years old when his father announces that he has secured a congressional appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. Grant does not want to go. This is not a small detail. Throughout his life, Ulysses Grant will demonstrate a pattern of finding himself in situations he did not choose and performing at the very highest level of human capability. West Point is the first instance. He does not want to go, he goes. The paperwork filed by Congressman Thomas Hamer identifies him as Ulysses S. Grant. Grant tries briefly to correct the error. He writes home that the Army has given him a new name. "I am now U.S. Grant," he tells his family. Since those initials could stand for Uncle Sam, the upperclassmen at West Point immediately latch onto the joke. He becomes Sam Grant and would be called that by his closest friends for the rest of his life. His academic performance at West Point is middling. He ranks 21st in a graduating class of 39, not failing, not exceptional, solidly in the middle of the pack. He is particularly strong in mathematics, which is the only academic subject that seems to genuinely interest him. He reads voraciously in the library, ignoring the standard curriculum in favor of novels and history and whatever else catches his attention. He is also, at West Point, the best horseman the Academy has seen in years. In his final year, during the horsemanship demonstration, a traditional showpiece event, he sets a school record for jumping height that will stand for 25 years. The assembled crowd, including the distinguished visitors who have come to observe the Academy's exhibition, watches in silence and then erupts. This quiet young man from Ohio, who did not want to be here, who barely passed his coursework, who made no speeches and sought no attention, this young man on horseback is something the observers have never quite seen before. He graduates in 1843. His first request, be assigned to the cavalry. The Army assigns him to the infantry instead. He is not surprised. Things rarely go the way Grant plans. He goes to the infantry. Julia Dent, the love that held HIM together 1844, White Haven Plantation, St. Louis, Missouri. His West Point roommate is Frederick Dent, the son of a substantial St. Louis family whose wealth rests in part on slave labor. Frederick Dent's father, Colonel Frederick Dent SR. The title is honorific, owns White Haven, an 850-acre plantation outside St. Louis. He is a Southerner in temperament and a Democrat in politics, and he represents everything that Jesse Root Grant, Ulysses' abolitionist father, despises about American society. Before Grant ships out to his first assignment in Missouri, Frederick Dent invites him to visit the family plantation. This is where Ulysses Grant meets Julia Dent. Julia Boggs Dent is 18 years old, the daughter of Colonel Dent, a woman of warm vivacity and unconventional confidence who has grown up on a plantation and possesses the easy, comfortable social grace of someone who has never doubted her own importance. She rides horses, an immediate bond with Grant. She is cheerful, warm, and entirely certain of herself in the way that people who have always been loved tend to be. She also has a slight eye condition, a condition called strabismus, which gives her eyes an appearance of misalignment that contemporary portraits capture clearly. Grant will love her faithfully and completely for the remaining 40 years of his life. He will never, through all the loneliness and failure and war and triumph and disaster that follows, waver in his devotion to Julia Dent Grant. She is, in the truest sense, the emotional foundation of everything he accomplishes. When he is away from her during the Mexican War, during the long, isolating Western postings before the Civil War, he becomes depressed, unmoored, and susceptible to drinking. When she is with him, he is steady, clear, and functional. The pattern is so consistent across his entire adult life that it constitutes a psychological truth. Ulysses Grant without Julia is a man capable of destroying himself. Ulysses Grant with Julia is one of the most effective human beings who ever lived. He proposes to her in the spring of 1844 before he ships out to join the army in Louisiana. She accepts. There is a problem. His abolitionist father despises the slave-owning Dent family. Julia's father despises the abolitionist, working-class Grant family. When Ulysses and Julia finally marry, on August 22, 1848, 4 years after their engagement, the delay forced by the Mexican War, neither set of in-laws will speak cordially to the other. Jesse Grant and his wife do not attend the wedding. Grant does not comment on this publicly. He almost never comments on things that hurt him. He absorbs them and moves forward. The Mexican-American War, the School of War 1846-1848, Mexico. The Mexican-American War is, by Grant's own later assessment in his memoirs, one of the most unjust wars in the history of the United States, a war of imperial aggression against a weaker neighbor. Engineered by a slave power-dominated government seeking to expand slave territory westward. I do not think there was ever a more wicked war than that waged by the United States on Mexico, he writes decades later. I thought so at the time when I was a youngster, only I had not moral courage enough to resign. This is a remarkable thing for a man to say. It is also, characteristically, completely honest. He fights in it anyway, he fights with distinction. He serves under two commanding generals, Zachary Taylor in northern Mexico and Winfield Scott in the campaign to Mexico City, and absorbs everything both men know. Taylor's style is aggressive and uncomplicated. He trusts his instincts, moves fast, and does not overthink. Scott is methodical, meticulous, a master of logistics and operational planning. Grant watches both men, he takes notes. His personal courage in the war is remarkable, and it displays itself in a way that defines his particular kind of bravery, not the showy, conspicuous heroism of a man who charges forward to be seen, but the quiet, practical bravery of a man who sees what needs to be done and does it. In the Battle of Monterey, he volunteers, without orders, to ride through streets under active fire to carry a message requesting more ammunition. He clings to the side of his horse, swinging out of the line of fire in a maneuver he learned years earlier breaking horses in Georgetown, and makes it through. The act saves his unit's position. In the assault on Mexico City, he personally hauls a mountain howitzer, a light artillery piece, up the tower of a church through a trapdoor, and uses it to bombard a nearby Mexican battery that has been pinning down his infantry. The act is improvised, unauthorized, and completely effective. His commanding officer, asked afterward about the incident, says it was the most beautiful piece of artillery work he saw in the war. Grant does not talk about it. He never talks about his courage. He simply acts. He sees things in the Mexican War that settle permanently in his military mind. He sees how logistics, the supply of an army, matters more than tactics in the long run. He sees how leadership at the small unit level, the personal courage and decisiveness of junior officers, determines whether an assault succeeds or fails. He sees how the will of an army depends on the will of the man at the top. And he sees how war looks from the ground, not from the maps, not from the headquarters tent, but from the mud and blood and grinding work of actually killing and being killed. This knowledge, absorbed in Mexico when he is 23 and 24 years old, will inform everything he does 20 years later when the stakes are not a foreign war of dubious legality, but the survival of the American Republic itself. The Wilderness Years, Failure, Drink, and Survival 1848-1861. St. Louis, Missouri, Sackett's Harbor, New York, Fort Vancouver, Washington, Fort Humboldt, California, Galena, Illinois. The 7 years between the Mexican War and the Civil War are the period that would become the central mythology of the Grant story, the years his enemies would use against him for the rest of his life, and the years that, in a different reading, explain everything about the man he becomes. He marries Julia in August 1848. They are deeply happy. He is assigned to Detroit, then to Madison Barracks in upstate New York. Julia is with him, and he is fine. Then in 1852, he is transferred without Julia, who is pregnant with their second child and cannot travel, to Fort Vancouver in the Oregon Territory, and then to Fort Humboldt in Northern California. Julia stays in Missouri with her family. The separation is devastating. Fort Humboldt is in the redwoods of Northern California, a remote, rainy, isolated posting with almost nothing to do. Grant writes to Julia constantly, letters full of longing and depression that paint a picture of a man who has no idea what to do with himself when he is alone. He has no work that requires his full engagement. He has no Julia. He has no purpose. He drinks. How much he drinks is a question that has been debated for 170 years. The evidence suggests that Grant, when isolated and purposeless, was susceptible to drinking episodes and periods during which he drank to excess. The evidence also suggests that his tolerance for alcohol was genuinely low, that 2 drinks affected him the way 8 drinks might affect another man. A small amount, visible to observers, was enough to make him appear intoxicated when other men who had drunk more would not. His commanding officer at Fort Humboldt is a cold, bureaucratically precise regular army officer named Colonel Robert C. Buchanan, no relation to the president, who has no patience for officers who fail to maintain their dignity at all times. In the spring of 1854, he confronts Grant about his drinking and gives him a choice: resign from the army or face a court-martial for intoxication on duty. Grant, facing the choice, does something that requires understanding his psychology to fully comprehend. He does not fight. He does not appeal to superior officers. He does not deny the charge or argue the circumstances. He resigns. He is 32 years old, with no civilian occupation, no money, and a family to support in Missouri. He resigns with the quiet dignity of a man who has done something he is not proud of, accepts the consequences, and intends to move forward. What follows is 7 years of failure, and they are real failures, not romantic mythology. He tries farming a piece of Julia's family land outside St. Louis, land he clears himself and on which he builds a small house with his own hands. He calls it Hardscrabble. The name is not ironic. He is a West Point graduate and a Mexican War veteran who cut firewood to sell on the streets of St. Louis because the farm did not generate enough income to support his family. There is a famous story, probably true, at least in its essentials, of people recognizing the former war hero on a street corner, selling Christmas trees in the bitter Missouri winter. He tries various things. He works as a bill collector. He applies for a position as county engineer and is rejected by the Republican county commissioners, who believe him to be, by association with Julia's Democratic family, politically unreliable. He works briefly for his father-in-law at White Haven. Nothing works. In the spring of 1860, his younger brother Orville offers him a job as a clerk in the family leather goods store in Galena, Illinois. Grant accepts. He is 38 years old, formerly a hero of the Mexican War, currently a store clerk in a small Illinois town, and he accepts without complaint. He does not drink heavily in Galena. He has Julia with him. He is stable, sober, and unremarkable, one of several thousand middle-aged men of modest achievement living quietly in small Midwestern towns, waiting for history to require them. History is about to require him. The Civil War begins, the return of the soldier, April 12, 1861, Fort Sumter, South Carolina. Confederate artillery opens fire on the Federal garrison at Fort Sumter. The Civil War begins. Grant is in Galena, Illinois, on the day the news arrives. He is 38 years old, a former Army captain, currently employed as a clerk in a leather goods store at a salary of $600 a year. He walks to the courthouse square. Galena's citizens are gathering, talking, arguing about what to do. Governor Richard Yates of Illinois is calling for volunteers. Someone needs to organize them, drill them, get them ready for war. Grant has a quality that is about to prove extremely valuable. He is the only man in Galena who knows how to drill troops. He runs the meeting. He takes charge not dramatically, not by claiming authority, but simply by being the person who knows how this works and doing it. He drills the Galena volunteers. He helps organize the first company. He writes to the War Department, offering his services, offering to command a regiment. The War Department does not answer. Grant's offers are ignored. His reputation for drinking, attached to his name like a scarlet letter from his Fort Humboldt resignation, follows him everywhere. He writes letters, he makes visits. He is turned away or simply not responded to repeatedly. He persists. Finally, through a combination of political connection and the Army's desperate need for anyone with genuine military experience, he is given command of the 21st Illinois Volunteer Infantry. They are, by every account, a disaster, undisciplined, badly organized, prone to outright mutiny against their previous officers. They are exactly the kind of regiment that requires a particular kind of man. Grant takes command. He does not give a speech. He does not explain his vision or appeal to their patriotism or threaten them with consequences. He simply begins drilling them day after day with the patience and persistence and total calm of a man who knows exactly what he is doing. Within weeks, the 21st Illinois is transformed. Governor Yates, watching this transformation, recommends Grant for a brigadier generalship. He receives it on August 7, 1861. He is Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant, United States Army. He has been a store clerk for 14 months. Fort Donelson, Unconditional Surrender Grant, February 12, 1862, Fort Donelson, Tennessee. The Union Army's strategic situation in the West in the winter of 1862 is deeply complicated. Confederate forces have established a defensive line across Kentucky and northern Tennessee. And two key river forts, Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River, anchor the Confederate position and threaten the Union's ability to penetrate the Confederate interior. Grant moves against Fort Henry first in early February. The Navy reduces it in a matter of hours. Fort Donelson is harder. It is defended by approximately 12,000 Confederate troops under three generals, John B. Floyd, Gideon Pillow, and Simon Bolivar Buckner, and sits on a bluff above the Cumberland River with artillery positions that can sweep the approaches. Grant moves his army up the river, cuts off the Confederate escape routes, and begins siege operations. What happens next contains the first glimpse of Grant in full. On the morning of February 15, Grant is away from the main lines when the Confederates launch a massive breakout attempt, a concentrated assault on his right flank that nearly succeeds in punching an escape corridor through the Union lines. When he returns and receives the news, the officers around him are shaken, talking about retreat. Grant looks at them. He is absolutely calm. "Some of our men are pretty badly demoralized," says one officer, "but the enemy must be more so, for he has attempted to escape and failed." This insight that the Confederate attack, however successful it appeared in the short term, meant that the Confederate position was actually desperate, is the signature of Grant's military mind. Where other officers see danger, Grant sees opportunity. Where others see the enemy's strength, Grant sees its weakness. He counterattacks immediately. By nightfall, the Union has recaptured everything and tightened the siege. Faced with the impossibility of either escape or continued resistance, the Confederate generals begin the process of surrender. Floyd and Pillow, senior officers who know they face potential war crimes charges for their pre-war actions as federal officials, transfer command to Buckner and flee. Nathan Bedford Forrest, a future Confederate cavalry genius and after the war, founder of the Ku Klux Klan, leads his cavalry through a gap in the Union lines rather than surrender. Buckner is left with 12,000 men and no options. He sends Grant a message requesting terms. Grant's reply becomes one of the most famous communications in American military history. No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works. Buckner is stunned. He and Grant had been friends in the Army. Buckner had, in fact, loaned Grant money during the worst of his post-Fort Humboldt poverty. Now Grant is demanding his immediate, unconditional surrender with language that sounds more like a threat than a negotiation. The Confederate surrender at Fort Donelson captures approximately 12,000 soldiers, the largest surrender of American troops since the Revolution. It breaks open the Confederate defensive line, opens the entire Tennessee and Cumberland River systems to Union penetration, and forces the evacuation of Nashville, the first Confederate state capital to fall. More importantly, it introduces Ulysses S. Grant to the American public. The newspapers seize on the phrase, unconditional and immediate surrender. His initials, U.S., suddenly stand for something new. He becomes Unconditional Surrender Grant. The country, desperate for a winner after months of Union defeats and humiliations, has found one. Abraham Lincoln receives the news from Fort Donelson with undisguised delight. He promotes Grant to Major General. Shiloh, the baptism of fire and the demand for removal April 6-7, 1862. Shiloh, Tennessee, 2 months later, Grant nearly loses everything. His army is encamped near Pittsburgh Landing. Tennessee, a site on the Tennessee River, where he is waiting for reinforcements before advancing further south against the Confederate Rail Center at Corinth, Mississippi. It is early April, the spring is warm, the army is confident after Fort Donelson, the mood is aggressive. On the morning of April 6, 1862, the Confederate Army under General Albert Sidney Johnston, 45,000 men assembled in secret over several days. Their movement, somehow undetected by Grant's reconnaissance, crashes into the Union camps at dawn. It is as complete a surprise as the American army has ever suffered. The battle's first day is a catastrophe of confusion and blood. Union regiments caught in their tents are shattered before they can form. Officers are killed before they can give orders. The confused terrain, dense undergrowth, ravines, thickets of trees, breaks every organized formation into chaos. Men fight and die in small clusters, separated from their commands, sometimes unable to find other Union soldiers at all. Grant, who had been 6 miles away receiving medical treatment for an ankle injury, rides to the battlefield. He is calm. He is, by every account, completely calm. He does not panic. He does not begin the mental calculation of retreat. He rides the lines, stabilizes what can be stabilized, repositions what can be repositioned, and begins the coordination of reinforcements that are arriving by river transport. That night, thousands of Union soldiers huddle under the riverbank, shattered by the day's fighting, refusing to return to their units. It is raining. The thunder of the artillery and the screaming of the wounded fill the darkness. A colleague finds Grant standing under a tree, his coat soaked, a lantern in his hand, staring into the middle distance. "Well, Grant," says the officer, "it is William Tecumseh Sherman, who will become Grant's most trusted military partner. We've had the devil's day of it, haven't we?" "Yes," says Grant. "Lick 'em tomorrow, though," he does. On April 7, with the arrival of reinforcements under General Don Carlos Buell, Grant launches a counteroffensive that drives the Confederate Army, now under General P.G.T. Beauregard, Johnston having been killed the previous afternoon, from the field. The Battle of Shiloh ends in a Union victory, though at a cost that shocks the nation. Approximately 13,000 Union casualties and 10,700 Confederate, nearly 24,000 men killed, wounded, or missing in 2 days of fighting, at that point the bloodiest battle in American history. The reaction in the North is not triumph, it is horror. How had Grant been surprised? Why had he not fortified his camps? Why had so many men died? The demands for his removal begin immediately and reach all the way to the White House. Lincoln is told by congressmen and newspaper editors and various military advisors that Grant must be relieved of command, that he is incompetent or drunk or both. That Shiloh demonstrates beyond question that he cannot be trusted with an army. Lincoln's response has passed into legend. "I can't spare this man," the president says. "He fights." 3 words. "I can't spare this man, he fights." In the entire Union Army, which in the spring of 1862 has produced an almost unbroken record of defeats, stalemates, and missed opportunities, Ulysses Grant is the only general who, when struck, strikes back. The only general who, faced with catastrophe, says "lick 'em tomorrow" and means it. Lincoln cannot spare this man, he fights. Grant survives the Shiloh controversy. His reputation is damaged. His superiors are now suspicious of him, but he is not removed. He is not the kind of man you remove. Vicksburg, the masterpiece, October 1862, July 4, 1863, the Mississippi River Valley. The fall of 1862 brings Grant to the problem that will define his genius: Vicksburg. Vicksburg. Mississippi sits on a 200-foot bluff above the eastern bank of the Mississippi River, a natural fortification that Confederate engineers have converted into a virtually impregnable defensive position bristling with artillery. Abraham Lincoln calls Vicksburg the key to the Confederacy. He is right. As long as Vicksburg stands, the Confederacy can use the Mississippi River to supply its armies in the West, communicate between its eastern and western halves, and maintain its economic connections with the vast agricultural region on the river's western bank. Take Vicksburg and the Confederacy is cut in two. The problem is that Vicksburg cannot be taken frontally. The river approaches are dominated by Confederate artillery. The terrain to the north, the Yazoo Delta, is a maze of swamps, bayous, and flooded bottomland through which no army can march. Repeated Union attempts to find a way in have failed. For 9 months, Grant tries every approach that presents itself. He digs canals. He attempts amphibious assaults. He sends his cavalry on long raids to distract Confederate attention. He tries 6 different approaches before settling on the one that works, and the one that works is so bold that his own officers, including Sherman, tell him he is going to lose his army. In April 1863, Grant marches his army down the western bank of the Mississippi, past the Vicksburg batteries, running his Navy's gunboats past the Confederate guns at night in a terrifyingly dangerous river transit, and crosses to the eastern bank at Bruinsburg, Mississippi, 40 miles south of Vicksburg. He is now on the right side of the river, south of the fortress, with his supply line cut, deliberately cut. Grant has decided to live off the land, to forage his 44,000 men from Mississippi's farms and storehouses, rather than wait for the supply train that cannot safely move through Confederate territory. He is marching an army of 44,000 men into the heart of enemy country, with no supply line, no clear line of retreat, and a fortress full of Confederates in front of him. In 17 days, without a base of supply, living on foraged food, Grant fights and wins 5 separate battles: Port Gibson, Raymond, Jackson, Champion Hill. Big Black River Bridge drives the Confederate forces back into Vicksburg and plants his army around the city in a complete siege. The Confederate commander inside Vicksburg, Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton, has approximately 31,000 men, enormous quantities of artillery, and impregnable fortifications. He cannot escape. He cannot be resupplied, he can only wait. He waits 47 days. On July 4, 1863, the 4th of July, chosen by Pemberton in the hope that Independence Day terms might be more generous, he surrenders his entire army to Ulysses Grant. 31,000 Confederate soldiers, 60,000 muskets, 172 artillery pieces. The Mississippi River, from its source to the Gulf, is now entirely in Union hands. The Confederacy is cut in half. Lincoln can barely contain himself. The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea. The Vicksburg campaign is, by any serious military assessment, a masterpiece of operational art, bold conception, meticulous execution, extraordinary improvisation, and the kind of sustained, grinding persistence that turns tactical momentum into strategic victory. Military historians compare it to the greatest campaigns in history. Grant himself, in his memoirs, writes about it with the quiet pride of a craftsman discussing his finest work. But before Grant can rest, the news from Pennsylvania changes everything. Chattanooga, the siege broke in November 1863, Chattanooga, Tennessee. Gettysburg and Vicksburg have both fallen on the same summer, and the Union is in a better strategic position than at any point since the war began. But in September 1863, at the Battle of Chickamauga in northern Georgia, a Union army under General William Rosecrans is catastrophically defeated by Confederate forces under General Braxton Bragg and driven back into Chattanooga, where it is now effectively besieged. The city is surrounded on three sides by Confederate forces occupying the heights. The supply line is cut, the army is starving. Lincoln turns to Grant. Grant arrives in Chattanooga in October 1863, traveling through 40 miles of muddy mountain roads on a badly injured horse. Arriving in such poor physical condition from a recent fall that he can barely walk. He is received by the beleaguered army with something close to reverence, the general who had never been beaten, arriving to solve the problem that no one else could solve. Within 48 hours of his arrival, Grant has diagnosed the problem, identified the solution, and set the machinery in motion. He opens a supply line, the cracker line, as the soldiers call it, within a week, ending the starvation rations that had been wearing down the army's will to fight. Then in late November 1863, he attacks. The Battle of Chattanooga is a 3-day operation that unfolds partly according to plan and partly in ways that no one planned at all. On November 25, Grant orders a diversionary assault on the Confederate center at Missionary Ridge, a 400-foot ridge rising almost vertically above the valley floor, whose lower slopes Grant intends the Union troops to capture and hold. What happens instead? The Union soldiers, having taken the rifle pits at the base of the ridge, look up, see Confederate soldiers at the top, and without orders, without authorization, without any coordinated plan, begin climbing. 4 divisions of men on their own initiative attack up a 400-foot fortified ridge. Grant watches from a hilltop observation point. He turns to the officer next to him and says, "Who ordered those men up the ridge?" No one had. The men took it anyway. The Confederate line breaks. Bragg's army retreats in near-total disorganization. Chattanooga is secure. The road to Atlanta, and with it, the road to the Confederate heartland, is open. Lincoln reads the dispatches from Chattanooga and makes his decision. Grant is coming east. Grant is going to command everything. Lieutenant General, the whole war. March 1864, Washington, D.C. On March 9, 1864, Abraham Lincoln meets Ulysses Grant in person for the first time. The occasion is a White House reception, a crowded, formal affair with hundreds of guests, at which Grant is supposed to appear as a celebrated general receiving the thanks of the Capitol. It does not go as planned. When Grant arrives, the crowd surges toward him with a force that nearly creates a dangerous crush. The hero of Fort Donelson and Vicksburg and Chattanooga, the man who had never been beaten. The man who fights. Grant, embarrassed and clearly deeply uncomfortable with the attention, is compelled to stand on a sofa so the crowd can see him. He sweats, he looks miserable. Lincoln, watching this, is charmed. "Why, he's a little fellow," says one observer, surprised. Lincoln towers over him. The next day, Lincoln officially promotes Grant to Lieutenant General, a rank that in the American Army had previously been held by only one man, George Washington. He is placed in command of all the Union armies, 533,000 soldiers in 17 major military organizations spread across the entire country. Grant's strategy for winning the war is simple, brutal, and, to the professional military mind, obvious. He states it to Lincoln clearly: find out where your enemy is, get at him as soon as you can, strike at him as hard as you can and as often as you can. And keep moving on. 2 phrases define his approach: continuous pressure and no retreating. Every Union army on every front will move simultaneously, depriving the Confederacy of the ability to shift forces from one threatened point to reinforce another. The Confederacy, already badly strained by Vicksburg and Chattanooga, will be squeezed at every point until something breaks. He personally takes the field with the Army of the Potomac in Virginia, not because the Army of the Potomac's formal commander, George Meade, is ineffective, but because the Virginia front, facing Robert Lee, is the most critical theater and requires the most direct supervision. On May 4, 1864, 120,000 Union soldiers crossed the Rapidan River into northern Virginia. The Overland Campaign begins. The Overland Campaign, the grinding machine, May, June 1864. Virginia. The Overland Campaign is the most controversial 6 weeks of Grant's military career. It is also, properly understood, the campaign that won the war. It begins in the wilderness, a dense, tangled tract of second-growth forest and undergrowth in central Virginia, where the road network is minimal and visibility beyond 100 yards is almost non-existent. Lee attacks Grant the moment he enters this terrain, recognizing that the forest will neutralize Grant's massive advantage in artillery and numbers. For 2 days, the armies fight in the wilderness in battles that are essentially enormous, confused brawls, units losing their positions, regiments fighting blindly through underbrush. Commanders issuing orders based on sounds rather than sight, fires breaking out in the dry scrub and burning men alive where they fall. The Union casualty count is staggering, approximately 17,500 men in 2 days. Every previous commander of the Army of the Potomac, after a comparable bloodbath, had retreated to Washington to regroup, resupply, and wait for better weather. 7 commanders before Grant had retreated in the face of Lee's army. 7 commanders had brought the Army of the Potomac south with high hopes and brought it back north with a broken nose. On the night of May 7, when the Army of the Potomac begins to move, when the soldiers realize which direction the column is heading, something unprecedented happens. The men had been expecting to march north, to retreat. They have retreated after every battle. The column turns south. Grant is moving toward Richmond, not away from it. The soldiers realize what is happening and begin to cheer. Men who have fought for 2 days in the most hellish terrain in North America and watched thousands of their friends die, these men cheer because they are not retreating. The general will not let them retreat. It becomes the central narrative of the Overland Campaign. Grant will not retreat. Lee defeats him at the Wilderness, at Spotsylvania Court House, at Cold Harbor, and each time, Grant swings to the south, keeps moving toward Richmond, keeps the pressure on. Keeps killing Confederates at a rate that the Confederacy, with its shrinking manpower reserve, cannot sustain. Cold Harbor is the darkest moment. On June 3, 1864, Grant orders a frontal assault on entrenched Confederate positions that fails catastrophically. Approximately 7,000 Union casualties in the first hour of fighting. In scenes of carnage so appalling that Grant later writes it was the only attack he regretted ordering in the entire war. The butcher narrative is born at Cold Harbor. Grant's enemies, then and for generations afterward, will point to his casualty lists and say, he won through slaughter. He fed men into the Confederate guns until the Confederates ran out of ammunition. It is the wrong calculation, and it has distorted the historical understanding of the Overland Campaign for 160 years. Grant's losses in the 40 days between the Rapidan and the James River were approximately 55,000 men. Lee's losses were approximately 33,000, but Grant had manpower reserves that Lee did not. More importantly, at the end of the Overland Campaign, Grant had pinned Lee's army in a siege at Petersburg, Virginia. Lee can no longer maneuver. He can no longer shift forces to other theaters. He can no longer win the war. He can only wait. Grant has not won yet, but he has made it impossible for Lee to win. In the fall of 1864, his general Philip Sheridan destroys the Shenandoah Valley, the breadbasket of the Confederacy, and the invasion corridor Lee has used to threaten Washington 3 times. His general William Tecumseh Sherman captures Atlanta in September, breaking the back of Confederate civilian morale just in time to secure Lincoln's re-election. His army in the West cuts the South in half once more as Sherman marches to the sea. By April 1865, it is over. Lee has no food, he has no ammunition, he has no room to maneuver. He sends Grant a message requesting a meeting. We are back in the McLean house. We are back where this story began. The presidency, the soldier becomes president March 4, 1869. Washington, D.C. The election of 1868 requires almost no effort from Grant. He is, by a margin so wide that it requires no campaign whatsoever, the most popular man in the United States. His campaign slogan, "Let us have peace," captures the exhausted longing of a country that has just endured 4 years of catastrophic warfare. He runs against Horatio Seymour of New York and wins 214 electoral votes to Seymour's 80. he is 46 years old. He is the youngest man ever elected to the presidency up to that point, a record he holds for some time. He arrives at the White House with no political experience, no administrative background, no knowledge of the machinery of civilian government. He has spent his entire adult life as a soldier, a farmer, a store clerk, and a soldier again. The transition from military command to democratic governance, from giving orders to building coalitions, is one that many military heroes have failed to make. Grant will make it imperfectly. But he will make it. His inaugural address is short and plain, characteristically Grantian in its directness. He ends it with two sentences that are, in retrospect, the most revealing of his entire public career. I know no method to secure the repeal of bad or obnoxious laws so effective as their stringent execution, and I shall on all subjects have a policy to recommend, but none to enforce against the will of the people. The first sentence is the soldier speaking. The second sentence is the democratic citizen speaking. The tension between them, the tension between executive force and democratic accountability, will define his entire 8 years in the White House. Reconstruction, the Crusade for Black Citizenship, 1869-1877, the American South. This is the part of the Grant story that his own era largely misunderstood, that the lost cause mythology deliberately buried for a century, and that modern historians have slowly, painstakingly dug back up. Ulysses S. Grant was the most aggressive defender of African American civil rights of any president between Abraham Lincoln and Lyndon B. Johnson. This is not an exaggeration. It is a historical fact that survived a century of deliberate suppression. In the aftermath of the Civil War, the South is not peacefully accepting the outcomes of the conflict. Former Confederates, many of them former officers and office holders, have organized into a campaign of terrorism against the newly freed black population and the Republican governments that are attempting to implement Reconstruction. The Ku Klux Klan, founded in 1865 by former Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest, has become a full-scale paramilitary insurgency by 1868, burning churches, murdering teachers, assassinating black office holders, and using systematic violence to drive black voters away from the polls and restore white democratic dominance across the South. This is, to call it by its correct name, a domestic terrorist organization conducting a targeted campaign of political murder and racial violence to overthrow the results of the Civil War. Grant goes after them. In 1870 and 1871, he pushes Congress to pass the Enforcement Act's sweeping federal legislation that makes it a federal crime to interfere with the rights of citizens under the 14th and 15th Amendments. The Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, the most aggressive use of federal power against domestic terrorism in American history up to that point, gives Grant the authority to suspend habeas corpus, declare martial law, and deploy federal troops to break up the Klan. He uses it. In October 1871, Grant suspends habeas corpus in 9 counties of upstate South Carolina, the first peacetime suspension in American history, and sends federal troops into the region. The sweeping arrests that follow essentially destroy the South Carolina Klan. Hundreds of Klansmen are tried in federal court. Hundreds more flee the state rather than face prosecution. Grant also signs the 15th Amendments implementing legislation, ensuring that black men across the South have the formal and protected right to vote, and deploys federal resources to ensure that right can actually be exercised. During the Grant years, African Americans serve in the United States Senate, in the House of Representatives, in state legislatures, as judges, as sheriffs, as postmasters, as local officials across the South. More black Americans hold elected office during the Grant administration than at any subsequent point until the 1970s. This is not a minor footnote, this is a social revolution. And Grant is the man making it happen, with federal troops, with federal prosecutors, with the full force of the executive branch deployed against the domestic terrorist network trying to undo it. He also presses Congress to ratify the 15th Amendment, which guarantees the right to vote regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. When the amendment is ratified in 1870, Grant sends Congress a message calling it a measure of gratefulness to 4 million human beings who had been liberated from slavery and for whose future this act ensures the full rights of citizenship. 4 million human beings. Grant knows exactly what he is talking about. He has spent his military career in a country whose deepest fracture was the question of whether those 4 million people were people. He spent the best years of his life winning a war to settle that question. He intends the settlement to hold. It does not hold, not permanently, not even close to permanently. The forces arrayed against black citizenship in the South are too powerful, too persistent, and too deeply embedded in the social and economic structures of the region for even the most aggressive federal intervention to overcome them permanently in the short time available. But Grant fights. He fights harder and more effectively and at greater political cost than any president before the mid-20th century. And history is only now beginning to give him proper credit for it. If this story moved you, if the arc from store clerk to Appomattox to dying man writing his masterpiece on a mountain porch says something to you about what human beings are capable of, hit the like button and let us know. We cover the complete story of every American president, every war, every crisis, every moment where one person's decision changed the direction of history. Subscribe and stay with us for the next one. And in the comments, your honest answer is Ulysses S. Grant an underrated president, or do the scandals of his administration genuinely disqualify him from serious consideration among the great ones? Did the reconstruction he built fail because of his own mistakes, or was it always going to be destroyed by forces larger than any president could have overcome? And if you could say one thing to the man sitting on the porch at Mount McGregor, pencil in hand, racing death to finish his story, what would you say? Leave your answer below. See you in the next one.